I've also started recording the webinar just so everyone is aware. I love to see an active chat box, so this is great. Well, it is 4 o'clock and I want to make sure that we end on time. So I'm going to kick us off here. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Feel free to chat in the chat box, network, share your information, where you're tuning in from. We also have a Q&A box. So feel free to post your questions for the speakers in there. And anytime we have after the presentations and panels will be dedicated to the Q&A. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today for what we hope is the first of many research-themed webinars here at Pale Blue Dot. My name is Lindsey, and I head up research and insights for the Pale Blue Dot team. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a seed stage climate tech VC, and we invest in solutions to reduce and reverse the effects of climate change, as well as those that will help us prepare for a new world. Research plays a large role in our investing thesis because we believe that climate impact isn't as straightforward as tons of carbon saved. So we really try to dive deep into the science behind climate tech innovations to help guide our decision-making process. But we also don't want to keep all of that information to ourselves because we want more people to become investors and entrepreneurs in the climate space. So last year, we launched a public Notion and a Substack newsletter where we publish many of our research topics. And we'll share links to both of those in our chat box. Please subscribe and you'll get to stay up to date on all of our projects and be the first to hear about the next event. But on to the topic of the day, which is forest and biodiversity. Forests are one of our most practical solutions for climate change mitigation, but they also provide the livelihood for about 1/5 of the global population. So global forests are on the decline, but the solution isn't as simple as just planting more trees because forests are complex ecosystems consisting of a variety of flora, fauna, and microorganisms that all function together. So by planting the wrong tree in the wrong place, you might actually be doing more harm than good. So today, you will hear from 3 startups, 2 from our own portfolio, who are all working to improve the situation for our forests and our global biodiversity. But first, I would like to introduce Anna-Lena Axelsson. Anna-Lena is an award-winning researcher and the coordinator of the forest program at SLU. She also works closely with the Swedish Forest Agency through the National Forest Data Lab. Anna-Lena, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Just try to share my screen. And to get the presentation going also. I think you see it in now. Got it on the wrong part. So you see it backwards first. So you see my starting picture with the SLU logo and our main message. As Lindsey said, I'm Anna-Lena Axelsson and I work at SLU. I've worked there for 25 years, more or less. Took my PhD there. Nowadays, I work mainly with collaboration and monitoring and assessment. I'm based in Umeå, in the northern parts of Sweden, in the taiga. But SLU also has the main campus is in Uppsala, where most of the researchers are based. We also have a campus in Alnarp. And I work with a lot of things at SLU, but one of my tasks is related to environmental monitoring and assessment. And what is that? SLU is not an ordinary university. We have education, we have research, but we also have this environmental monitoring and assessment. And you can say that that's what's normally placed in institutes in different parts of the world. So we do a lot of the institute's tasks. We collect a lot of data and we provide that to help the society with this citizen support on how to use our nature resources. And these programs we have 12 programs with 2 persons coordinating each of those programs. And I'm the head coordinator for the forest program. And I've worked on that for 17 years, more or less. And I do that part of my time. I also work with other things. But today I will present some of the work we do, which is related to biodiversity and sustainable forest management. And maybe you've seen this picture. It's from the Swedish government. And it's showing all of the different forest ecosystem services that's related to forest resources. And we have what we're mainly referring to economic values, which is coming mainly from material and energy. We also have food taken from the forest. We use the forest for recreation and tourism. And then we more and more talk about the possibility the forest can do carbon sequestration. And then we have the biodiversity values and the regulatory services, which is related to stabilizing the ground and buffering water and so on, and pollination, for example. And also mushrooms and fungi, of course. We will hear more of that later, I know. So that's an overview of all the different uses of the forest. And today there's a lot of discussions on how to use the Swedish forest resources. It's more and more scarce resources, and then you have to work more on balancing the different parts, the economic part, the ecologic parts, and the social forest values. That's one way to group it, and that's what we normally use when we discuss different types of values. We group them in these 3 groups. And these pictures are taken from a forecasting program that we have, where you can look at these different resources. You can look at the timber resources, the energy, habitats, the carbon sequestration, and also recreation values of the forest. And we have models for all this. And then we could we take in data into the system, and we can do forecasting. We have collected many different models in this system. And then we can get the future state of the forest and compare different alternatives. And also weigh different alternatives to each other. Do we want more timber, or do we want more biodiversity or carbon sequestrations? And then output from this system can be used for decision support. And I will tell you more about the data that we can get into the system later, but I think this is a very good way to show that we need to weigh things, to look at also the economic potential of different alternatives. And some of these things are very hard to put economic values on. Recreation, for example, how do we value that? And there we need more information and data. And also from these systems, you can take the results also, and you can present it visually to people that are non-experts into forestry, and then they can look at the resulting options and see which they like best. Here we have, for example, an example of where you have made some green tree retention when cutting a forest, and how this can look like in the future. And in the lower part, you see to the left the results after 110 years when you had retention, and to the right you have the result after 110 years if you didn't have a retention. And then you can compare alternatives and see what do you prefer. And it's a very good tool to communicate with non-experts that are not used to tables and statistics. And I think that's also an important part. How do we communicate information on biodiversity and conservation issues? And the base for all this that we do is the Swedish National Forest Inventory. It's a sample-based inventory that's been going on for 99 years. Next year we celebrate 100 years actually. So we have a very long time series. But in the beginning it was focused mainly on production indicators. But over the last 30 years we have collected more and more information on biodiversity issues, for example, dead wood and other indicators that are important for non-commercial parts of the forest. And this data is, of course, produced mainly from doing statistics, but also as data to input in the consequence analysis and forecasting tool that I presented. But then also different researchers can use this data for different applications. And it's more and more used for reference data for remote sensing applications, which is very important. I will talk about that a bit more later also. So this is very detailed data that's collected in the field in many spots, as you see. It's around 10,000 spots that are visited every year. That's a lot of data. We have a lot of old plots in the database also, of course. And one example, what you can get out of these time series are trends, of course. And here you can see an example from South Sweden, where we had a heathland, open heathlands 150 years ago, which has been replanted with spruce forests. So we have a sprucification of South Sweden. And Halland is the most extreme example, where we had quite a low amount of spruce forest before, but nowadays it's a dominating forest type. And that's an important change for biodiversity. And it's also in these areas where we have a lot of problems with spruce bark beetle, the Ips topographis today. And on the same plots as the Swedish Forest Inventory, we also perform a soil inventory. And there you look at the carbon content of the soil. But recently, they've also started to do DNA sequenciations of the soil samples. And they started out to look for fungi in the soil. And this is a really interesting data set where you can combine exact information on which species are there on the plot with long-term, more than 30 years of data collection on what type of forest there is and what has happened in these plots. And we're just starting to get into these data sets, and it's really very interesting data that I hope we can also make it open in the future for more people. You can look more into this if you look at svamparisverige.se, which is where they present the first results from this eDNA survey. We also have other monitoring connected to these plots. We look for terrestrial habitats that are reported to the EU Natura 2000 network. And we also work with another inventory called the Swedish Bird Survey, which is based at Lund University. And they have also systematic way of collecting data, but they also to use citizen science. So people are voluntarily collecting their data. And it's a really interesting example of where you can combine citizen science with systematic sampling. And I think that's a really important thing. This citizen science data is valuable, but if you can make it more systematic, it's even more valuable. And if you combine these two advantages, it's really strong. And this is a really good example on where this is actually happening. You've all heard about this new data, that we have a lot of information coming from remote sensing, and new sensors are coming all the time, and they're scanning more detailed and sending down loads and loads of data. And of course we use this. In this case, we have taken the national laser scanning, combined that with field plots from the Swedish NFI, and made through different statistical calculations, we produce wall-to-wall raster databases for Sweden. And there are several types of data sets which we have computed. The one in the middle here is showing the moisture content, water maps, showing the wetness index in the forest. And there's also information on the forest volume, species composition, and other height indexes of the forest and so on. But we're struggling still to do good mapping on the age of the forest, which is kind of hard to map. And we also need to make better maps on the species composition. And that's where our development are right now. So there are many different maps already, and there are new maps coming in where we use the new resources more and more. So you can check in on that if you want with the Forest Data Lab. And you find all these maps at the Swedish Forest Agency. So they're really good at packaging and showing the data in a really good in open map services. So we focus on producing the data, and they focus on presenting it. It's a really good cooperation. This is in Swedish only though, but we're discussing to make these services also available in English, make it more open. And I also already mentioned the National Forest Data Lab, which is a collaboration platform where we take the next steps into forest monitoring. And we are in LinkedIn and in Twitter, so if you want to follow us. And we also have a homepage. And then I just want to end to say something about the frequent satellite data that we have from Copernicus. I don't know if any of you startups are planning to work on this. I mean, there's a lot of data coming in, and very frequent data. Every 6 days, you will have a new data set over Sweden in this case, which is seen in this picture. So of course, there are many new users that are interested to use this data. But then you have to always figure out that it's really important to combine the remote sensing data with ground truth. And maybe you heard of this case where there was an article in Nature 2 years ago or something like that, which was published that stated that there was an abrupt increase in harvested forest area of Europe after 2015. And especially in Sweden and Finland, this increase was really big. However, the national statistics didn't show this increase. So the day after this article was published, there was something published from SLU and from the National Forest Agency showing that our statistics didn't show the same thing. And then there was a lot of discussions about the results, and it showed out finally that when we tested these results against the field plots from the Swedish and the Finnish inventories, it showed that the researchers had only relied on ready-made calculations, and they hadn't checked their results with the ground truth to see if they were correct. So even if this article is still published in Nature, so even if science, you're used to kind of trust highly profiled research results, but even a publication in Nature should be watched out in a critical way. This article is still published, actually, and there are matters arising, as you see there, but it's not taken away or rebutted. So I think it's really important to know that to not go too much into the. Of course, we should use remote sensing. It's a really good tool, but you have to use the right methods when you work with remote sensing data, and it's an absolute need to combine this with the ground truth to be able to say something about what we see in the satellite images, especially. And can we rely on science? I think it's important to also see that if there is one article which have a very special result, it's always good to check to see is this confirmed by another researcher or by other articles before you go on to draw too big conclusions from that. That's a recommendation, I would say, for both you who will invest in companies that will base their ideas on science, and also for startups that you need to look for a broad consensus within science before you kind of try to develop ideas. I think I stopped there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna-Lena, for talking about all of the data available through SLU and the importance of using that data. I would like to introduce now the first of our 3 startups, and Colin, invite you to share your screen and introduce everyone to Funga.
Hey, thanks so much for the introduction and the invitation to be here. And I'm excited to share more about what we're doing at Funga to address both the climate and the biodiversity crisis. And to begin, I just want to emphasize that most of what we know about forests and ecosystems really in general is based on things we can measure above ground. So ecosystem scientists might come to this place and count the number of trees they find, identify which species they are. They might even try and, as Anna-Lena just described, remotely sense features of this forest canopy from space. And all of this absolutely makes sense. Above ground is where photosynthesis happens. This is how carbon and energy enters forest ecosystems. But we also know most forests are limited in some really meaningful way by soil resources like water and nutrients. And to access those resources, trees need to build roots, and trees actually build quite a lot of roots. So in many forests, there can be as much or more biomass below ground and root structures as above ground in stems and leaves. And decades of research have made clear that, below ground ecology, what's going on in the soil, is really essential to understanding how these forest systems work. But when you look closely at these roots, and I mean very closely, like you'll need a microscope closely, you realize they're not really just roots at all. So they're also fungi. So most plants on Earth form a symbiosis with what we call mycorrhizal fungi. So this picture is an enlarged image of a fine root tip, one of the most distal or outermost in the tree's root system. And this thin layer of orange and white material is an ectomycorrhizal fungus. And what's going on here, of course, is they're trading. So the tree is trading photosynthetic sugars it gets above ground in exchange for nutrients that these fungi are really exceptional at acquiring below ground in soils. And one reason they're so good at this is because they build these vast hyphal networks in soil. So you can think of hyphae as roots, but for fungi instead of trees. And a handful of soil can easily contain over 100 kilometers of these hyphal threads coursing through it. But, thinking of fungi as thread is actually still way too big. They're far finer than that. They're about as fine as the individual strands of a spider's web or individual fibers of cotton. Because they're so fine, they can massively enhance plant access to these really crucially limiting soil resources. And so it's really not super surprising that many trees allocate and invest big time into these fungal partners. So this is 2 pine seedlings. And this white stuff is this hyphal network. And it's masked up so much now, you no longer need a microscope. In this particular image, in this particular early life stage, the plant is investing nearly as much in the fungus as it is in its own foliage. So that's how essential these fungi are to tree biology. They're really like an entire organ system. And yet this fungal aspect of forests has largely been ignored in forest management, except in places in Sweden. And it's one of the reasons they've been overlooked historically, though, is that it's been extremely difficult to study these organisms in the forest in nature. Historically, we've really relied on experiments that look something like this, what we sometimes call big tree, little tree experiments. And so the big tree was grown with its mycorrhizal fungi and the little tree was grown without them. And the inoculated seedling is clearly growing more vigorously, and other experiments might show it has greater drought tolerance. It's more likely to resist plant pathogen attacks. And these effects might vary based on the climate, based on soil factors, but this is how we know these fungi are essential to tree biology. But at the end of the day, experiments like this are really limited in some really crucial ways. And that's because a seedling really isn't a forest. And a forest never really has this non-mycorrhizal case. Some fungi are always present, and actually there's usually dozens to hundreds of mycorrhizal fungal species coexisting in a given forest. The question isn't really what happens whether or not these mycorrhizal fungi are present, but rather, what does this incredible sort of biodiversity of fungi actually mean for the functioning and the carbon capture of a forest? Or put more simply, what does a healthy forest microbiome look like? So we're much closer to answering this question for people than we are plants. So the Human Microbiome Project has really led on this topic. So scientists essentially in the Human Microbiome Project use DNA sequencing to characterize which bacteria live in thousands of people's stomachs. And importantly, they also noted health features of those same people. So that, are they sick? And if so, with what disease? What's their blood pressure? Things like this. And this kind of information allowed medical microbiologists to identify communities of bacteria linked to health and disease states. And this kind of science became the foundation of microbiome transplant therapies, essentially ecosystem restoration, but for your gut microbiome. And those therapies are now on the market today. So over the past 3 years, I run a research team at ETH Zurich, which is actually the foundation for our startup Funga. And we've tried to apply the methods of the Human Microbiome Project to the forest. And so what we've done is actually partnered with a forest monitoring network across Europe called ICP Forests, which has been documenting forest health, tree growth, and carbon capture across hundreds of locations in Europe. So this is a map of some of the places where we asked our collaborators to mail us soil so we could extract fungal DNA, sequence it, enrich it with all sorts of other genomic information, and try and understand, are there features of the fungal microbiome that are linked to forest productivity and carbon capture, even after we control for climate and soil factors and all the usual suspects that we know drive tree growth. And what we found is actually, at the end of the day, once you control for all this other stuff, features of the fungal microbiome are linked to threefold variation in tree growth. So there's situations where you could have 2 forests sitting side by side, same tree species, same climate, same soil factors, but one colonized by high-performing fungi can be capturing 3 units of carbon for every one in the analogous forests colonized by low-performing fungi, which is totally wild and exciting to us because, these fungal signatures, just like in the human microbiome, imply an opportunity to manage or engineer the forest fungal microbiome, first for tree growth and carbon capture, and next for the multitude of services we know these forests provide. But as we go down this path, one thing Funga is working to be very careful about is to avoid some of the problems we know we have had in above ground agriculture, which is an over-reliance on low diversity systems dominated by individual species and strains. Instead, by taking these sort of new community level approaches, we can now go the other way. We can identify biodiverse combinations of native fungal species that are actually responsible for these effects in the wild, and we can use those. And so this, is the evidence that we can actually do this again in the wild using biodiverse combinations of fungi that are actually native to these places. And so the history of agriculture has been historically an exercise in reductionism. We identify high-performing species and then strains of those species, and then we selectively breed them, and then we now begin to genetically modify them, and ultimately we plant them out in vast monocultures. And this has absolutely produced very productive, but also very fragile ecosystems. We now have the data, we have the computational tools to go the other way, to understand and lean into this biodiversity, and finally take advantage of all the things that complexity can do for ecosystem scale outcomes. And this is really the motivator for me and for the team at Funga. Can we make our managed food and forest landscapes reservoirs rather than deserts of biodiversity? And in the process, can we enhance yields and carbon capture and all the other services we ask of these ecosystems? I really think we can, but doing so requires a real total reframing of how we approach research and development and venture and scaling of biotechnology and ecosystems. And so this is the approach we've been taking at Funga, and this is the broader strategy we hope to inspire and see in the community as it develops.
Colin, thank you so very much. And now I'd like to go from below ground to above ground and ask Cameron from Pivotal to join us.
Oh, 1 second. Is that working?
Looks good.
Great. In that case, I will dive in. So Pivotal is a company founded on the belief that people should be financially better off restoring nature than destroying it. We're a British venture-backed remote-first company founded late last year. We are now working with regenerative farmers, foresters, and people carrying out rewilding to measure changes in biodiversity on their land. Our purpose is to help finance the regeneration of nature at scale. And to do this, we need to change the incentives to value outcomes for nature. This is the essence of the problem. It is very difficult to pay for measured outcomes for nature. There are payments for actions, such as planting mangroves or planting forests or planting hedges, using less fertilizer, but there are no payments for outcomes. Human impact on the planet can no longer withstand historic practices, and we need to now work with nature. There is policy in place, but the truth is that it is cheaper to destroy nature. And until relatively recently, humans were not so numerous that nature couldn't simply regenerate. Conservation is fundamental. It is absolutely essential, but it is now nowhere near enough. What we need is to finance restoration, and that finance needs to be linked to real gains, not to avoided loss. Biodiversity offsetting is law in 42 countries, but only for specific industries like oil and gas and mining. The Aichi targets, they've all failed. The world has failed every single target on nature ever set. There are, however, a growing number of pledges and movements, and this list is only a small sampling. They are committing to understand what their impact on nature is and to disclose these impacts. Many are committing to move to regenerative practices, sometimes for very practical reasons. And others are committing to become more nature positive and to offset the impact of their supply chains and their operations. But let's first look at some of the issues around why there is no existing system which links outcomes for nature with investment. There is no ton of biodiversity as there is with carbon. Everything about biodiversity is explicitly local. Each species, each habitat, each ecosystem is unique. And quantifying the species in abundance in a system is very difficult. If you're trying to measure gains made on degraded systems, changes can appear quickly, but small changes happen first, and these cannot be seen from space. Data needs to be collected on site, in place, and on the ground. A high level of biodiversity is one of the major outcomes of a healthy ecosystem, as is greater resistance to stresses, improved nutrient cycling, greater carbon sequestration, and better water retention. But the interplay between species and habitats and landscapes is not something we fully understand. It's also incredibly expensive. So one example I often give is my co-founder Zoe. She went out and did a biodiversity survey in Liberia, and she was gone for a month. She led a team of 15 people through the forest. There were 2 guards. There was a medic, and that was one team. That one team cost $500,000, as you might expect. There were 3 teams, and they had to go back twice. And that is the real cost of a high-quality biodiversity survey. It's incredibly manually intensive, and you often need teams of ecologists. And also, there's a tremendous data analysis pipeline. Fortunately, payments for restoration tend to be much higher than for carbon, reflecting the added value of ecosystem services. But a high-quality survey is still very far from affordable. The cost of monitoring can often significantly exceed what markets will pay for outcomes for nature. So if the cost of monitoring can exceed the market price for outcomes, and creating meaningful measures of gains and comparing these is challenging, what do? How do you enable people and companies wanting to become more nature positive to invest in outcomes for nature? Well, the first is to reduce the cost. You continue to use sampling-based methodology, as is done now, and accept that no set of technologies will be able to capture everything. We want to dramatically reduce the number of ecologists needed on the ground and the efficiency of data collection, and we also need the analysis to scale. And we can do this by having a field technician place sensors and collect data with drones, which can then be analyzed with machine learning and annotated and quality controlled by ecologists expert in that habitat. And you can reduce the number of people from, in Zoe's case, 15 down to 1. Able to do large areas in a much, much more efficient way. And then the ecologists that help to annotate the results can now be anywhere. And once they've helped with the annotation and to identify the species, identifying that species in the future becomes much more efficient. And the second thing is bring the math. You need to make it quantitative. You have the IUCN, which has prepared many different levels of categorization of habitats. And you can produce habitat maps, and these can be used to then compare equivalent habitats around the world. You also need to change the paradigm so that you're looking at change from a time point rather than from degradation from pristine, if that even exists. And this enables you to measure gains. Also, don't think of biodiversity as individual species, but rather as an ever-changing set of species. Indices have been developed to look at these, and in our case, we're using the Hill Index. And then also use the concept of significance. Now, this is something that the UN has developed over decades. There is a map with a pixel size of 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers covering the entire world. This is significance with a very biodiversity specific meaning. I would encourage everyone to look at that. You can then produce a measure of change, which can be used to monitor gains an area has made or to create a biodiversity credit. This is our very first pilot. This was 177 hectares of regenerative farm in Portugal. A very, very lovely couple very kindly offered us the chance to measure this site. And you'll see there are 30 different places where we placed acoustic sensors, either as single points or as arrays. And then we produced a habitat map using 2-centimeter resolution coverage. And then we also flew drones at really low altitude, really, really slowly to collect data on the ground. And this meant that we can look at grasses, we can look at shrubs, we can look at trees, we can look at some insects. With the acoustics, we can look at birds and bats, amphibians. We recorded tons of frogs, insects, small mammals. And all of this can then be turned into lists of species. We can use various ways of looking at relative abundance. These can then be turned into indices and indicators of biodiversity and then matched with the habitat classification. This is our second pilot. This is 70 hectares of agroforestry in England. It's actually a site run by the head of agroforestry for the Soil Association. And they're doing lots of really interesting things there. And we did a very similar process. So it's acoustics, habitat maps, very low level flights. And this is just the very beginning. To this, we can add many, many different kinds of sensors. And what we're trying to do, though, is increase the amount of information we get over time while retaining roughly the same amount of cost and effort to acquire that data. So what can a company or person do once they understand, even to some approximation, what their impact is on nature? Well, you can stack a biodiversity credit onto a carbon credit. This was actually one of the very first things that was proposed to us. People who are trying to evidence that they are planting biodiverse forests. If we can measure a gain in biodiversity, you could link a carbon price to that biodiversity gain. You could also look at purchasing a biodiversity credit. We've had direct requests from very large companies for exactly this, separate from a carbon credit. And then for the financial industry and for very large food groups and textile groups, you probably want to monitor what is happening on your supplier's land. And you could work with us to help evidence gains in biodiversity and what happens when you're switching to regenerative nature positive practices, because you need to evidence this to your own stakeholders. We're amazed by the amount of interest we're seeing from companies, from investors, from farmers, from foresters, and from people carrying out rewilding. And I want to thank everyone who has supported us as we've carried out our first pilots and are now supporting us as we start thinking about scaling. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cameron. So now we started off below ground. Now we're at the ground level. Let's take it a step even higher and hear from Indra over at Overstory. Indra, go for it.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Indra Bakker, CEO and co-founder of Overstory. Super grateful to be on this panel with these experts. It's such an important topic in these times, and it's the reason why Overstory exists. Better data is needed to improve decision making. And yeah, vegetation intelligence is critical to mitigating the climate and the biodiversity crisis, as well as preparing for new risk. And one big problem we're facing now are mega fires. Fires that are destroying huge areas of lands. And fires are complex, and not all fires are even bad. So it's a complex topic. And one of the most effective ways to combat these mega fires is sustainable forest management. It's the most cost-effective way to prevent these catastrophic mega fires. But nowadays, still decisions are often made on old data, while the conditions around these forests are changing rapidly as well. So this means that decision makers need more and access to more accurate real-time vegetation data across large areas of land. And at the same time, they need access to reliable predictions for the future. And it's actually interesting that we sometimes don't even know where trees are being cut and where not. So to have something reliable that also works at scale is something that many industries have been waiting for. And this is where Overstory comes in. We offer actionable vegetation intelligence at scale. And one of our first customer segments are electric utilities. We've all seen these mega fires in California or even in Australia and Southern Europe. And one of the biggest causes of these mega fires are trees falling into or growing into power lines, causing a spark. And because it's often in very remote areas, it's leading to very large fires. And for electric utilities, vegetation management is already the largest line item on their operational spend. So some utilities spend billions per year on vegetation management alone, but even small utilities, they spend millions per year on vegetation management. So it's a crucial component for them to stay alive and keep in business. And obviously what happened to PG&E, that is something that other utilities are trying to prevent. So understanding where the trees are that could potentially cause a huge fire or an outage is key for them. And this is where Overstory helps them to prevent more of these catastrophic wildfires. And we do that by identifying the likelihood of an ignition and what the consequences are of an ignition as well, so that we can also look at future risk by looking more broadly at forest health. Where do we have large patches of trees infested with the bark beetle, where we have a lot of dry fuel, so that we also know how does a certain ignition also spread and impact communities. We help them making it even more actionable by creating optimized vegetation trimming plans and verify if the work has actually been done. So have the trees in the field actually been removed and have the risk of a mega fire been reduced as well. So how does it work? We've heard a lot about different technologies before as well. We rely on very high resolution satellite images and apply machine learning to it to better understand vegetation at scale. I think Anna-Lena mentioned in our first talk as well. She mentioned the Copernicus data, which is public available satellite imagery of 10-meter resolution. We use commercial data, which is up to 30-centimeter resolution. And that allows us to really monitor vegetation on a tree level. So as you can see here, you can see some individual trees marked as species. Well, I think the purple ones are olive trees, for example. And having this level of detail and understanding on a species level is super important for our customers, because one single tree can actually lead to a mega fire, right? It's often that single tree that you miss that grows into the line or falls into the line and causes a big fire. So we cannot afford to miss a single tree. And these tree species are crucial to inform predictive vegetation in the site, because by knowing the tree species, we know the growth rate, the health, depending on the soil, the weather conditions as well. And we've done it for multiple customers across North America and Europe. For example, what I showed in the previous slide is in Spain, where we've identified 37 different vegetation species across 7 different climate zones. Similarly, like that, we work with customers in North America and other places in Europe as well. And the beauty of satellite imagery is that it also contains invisible light, like red edge and near-infrared bands, which tells a lot about the productivity and the health of a tree. So with this, we can identify in an early stage the stress level of a tree, or for example, infestations. And we're not only limited to certain areas of land, we can do this at state level or even country level. And that's important to understand the different dynamics, especially if you want to prevent these larger fires. As I mentioned before, you need to know what is the situation, the situational awareness around these potential points of ignition. So more concretely, we map these data layers to risk and assets of our customers. So we can identify where we can see an increase of risk of wildfire ignitions and what the consequences are of such an ignition. And this is not only based on remote sensing, we also have our in-house arborist. We have a former wildland firefighter as part of our team. So I think, as Ada mentioned before as well, data needs to be validated on the ground. So this is an important part of our process as well, while rolling this out to new locations. Because for us, it's about scaling local knowledge to larger territories so that we can make it actionable and also accurate enough to act upon. So what are some of the results that we got with some of our existing customers? We have several case studies on our website that you can download, but I want to briefly highlight 2 of them. One is with an electric utility in the US, where they saw a 46% efficiency improvement by using our data. So by using our data, they had a better understanding of where risks are, and they could move budget from low risk areas to high risk areas. So they could do more with the same budget. Same for another customer in North America, where by using our platform, they saw a 13 times return on investment by understanding where are these individual trees that are actually growing into my line. Instead of what they were doing now, they were flying helicopters and drones, sometimes even multiple every day. But we help them prioritize where to fly and where to go as well. Some of our customers, as you can see, across Europe and North America, a lot of electric utilities, but we actually also work with other types of organizations, for example, Rainforest Alliance, a certification body for coffee, cocoa, tea, where we monitor large areas of land in Africa, South America, Indonesia as well. Thank you so much, and looking forward to diving deeper into the discussions.
Thank you, Indra. And now I'd also like to welcome Zoe, who will be stepping in on our panel discussion for Pivotal. Zoe is one of the co-founders along with Cameron. And I would like to start off by maybe asking everyone to say something about why forests and biodiversity are so crucial in the fight against climate change. Maybe we'll start with you, Zoe.
Thanks, Lindsey. Sorry, trying to unmute. I think it's a big question. I think it's really important to say that almost every, if not every, major ecosystem service provided by the planet to humans is in some way sourced from biodiversity. And that includes climate regulation and carbon cycling. So I think that's the first really important point. But I think in more detail, biodiversity underpins an ecosystem's productivity, and it does that through various different mechanisms. For example, as the diversity of species increases in an ecosystem, in a forest or whatever it might be, and competition between those species increases, all the available niches in the ecosystem are more likely to be filled. And that means that the ecosystem's productivity relative to the supply of resources, a finite supply of resources in that system, is maximized. And when primary productivity is maximized, so is the carbon sequestration potential of that system. But just as importantly, more diverse ecosystems with more biodiversity in them are more resilient to disturbances. So things like diseases or environmental shocks, because there's more likely to be multiple species filling the same niche, which same functional niche, which therefore means that the system is better able to maintain its productivity in the face of population crashes. So for example, studies have shown that monoculture tree plantations survive much less well in drought conditions than forests with full of biodiversity. And so then when those monoculture plantations suffer dieback in something like a drought, they then can become net carbon emitters rather than carbon sinks. So even though they might be good at sequestering carbon in the short term, in the long term, their carbon storage potential is not as good as diverse, healthy forests. And that's especially true as we move into the future where climate change is inevitably going to happen on some level, and therefore these kind of shocks like droughts are more likely to happen. So biodiversity plays a role not just in climate change mitigation through carbon sequestration and better storage, but also adaptation, because it makes those ecosystems more resilient to the impacts that are inevitable as our climate starts to shift.
Would anyone like to add anything to that? Anna-Lena?
I think it was a very good summary, and I can see two direct implications from South Sweden to this. First, we have the spruce-dominated landscape that was, to a big extent, 200 years ago. There was not a lot of forest, but the trees that were there were deciduous trees. So there's been a major species change, which of course have made the forest more vulnerable to both storms and insects and drought, which has shown over the last 20 years. And then we also have exotic fungi coming in to threaten our species. For example, we have deciduous trees that are totally killed by new fungi, new exotic fungi coming in. So we have biodiversity that's not really good also moving into Sweden and killing the trees, and then taking away the habitats for all of the species, insects and other species that are really relying on these trees as a habitat. That's another problem, maybe a reverse problem. Thank you.
But equally important. But maybe on the flip side, is there sort of a misconception about the connection between forests and climate that you wish more people understood? Indra or Colin, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really interesting is that, there's this emerging sort of like tension between sort of engineered climate solutions and sort of natural climate solutions like forests. And I really don't think there should be, right? Like we need both, but the thing to keep in mind is that, forests and ecosystems are the tech that's ready to do carbon removal at scale today, right? And waiting 10 years for technology to come to scale, like puts us in a very, very bad space climate-wise. And you don't need to believe me, you can ask the IPCC. So I think that's really important. And the other thing I think, that we should touch on is that, there's this whole idea of permanence right now, right? Like it's really easy to imagine that we remove a carbon from the atmosphere with a machine or something and put it away forever. And that's great. But, carbon in ecosystem cycles, and it's supposed to. We want that to happen, right? None of the carbon lives there forever. but it still acts as a reservoir. You could think of it like a fountain, right? Like, none of the water in the bowl of the fountain stays there forever. And yet that reservoir, the fountain, as long as it's intact, remains a carbon reservoir. And so I think we need to get a bit more sophisticated on what we mean by durability and permanence if we're going to actually, value the carbon capture potential of forests in a meaningful way.
Yeah, no, I think that's very important. Indra, do you have any sort of misconceptions around forestry and climate that you wish more people understood?
Well, I think one thing that's close to what we do is also that not all fires are equal, right? So in most cases, we see fires as something, forest fires or wildfires as something bad, but actually fires have been part of healthy forest management for years and years. And this is something indigenous people have understood actually already for a long time and applied, for example, prescribed burning to keep the forest healthy, keep the soil healthy as well. And I think that's something that went wrong more on the west coast of the US, where we've been suppressing all fires, which actually resulted in an accumulation of fuel load, certain species that survived more, so related to all the things that been mentioned before. And that leads to these more catastrophic fires that I talked about. And combine that with more people living in wildland urban interfaces so close to forest, it leads to more severe circumstances as well. So I think we need to accept that we don't know everything about forest, that there's things that we still need to learn. And I think that's the starting point to get these misconceptions out of the way and be open to learn new things about how forests work, about the fungi, about biodiversity on a very local scale. I see lots of opportunities there where we should be open to learn and maybe adjust our views of how forests are healthy.
And on that note, Anna-Lena, I'd like to ask you if you have any advice to maybe potential investors on how to know whether a particular solution is backed by science.
Yeah, I think first you should check out the team. Who is in the team and what are their background? Have they done research within the area that they're working in, or are they using other types of research from other actors? That's one thing. And also, as I said before, are they relying on some kind of basic knowledge? Is a consensus where many researchers have, all the research society have kind of found that we can agree on this? Or are the solution based on one single article, which is maybe not agreeing with the today's consensus? Of course, that could be valuable, but it could be a bit risky to kind of go for that. So I think that's our two things that you can look into.
Look into the team and their backgrounds and the topic. That's great advice. Indra, I kind of along those lines of what evidence are you using to support your innovations. Can you speak a bit more about the role that local knowledge is playing in decision-making around forest management and how you're incorporating sort of that ground level verification?
Yeah, I think it's really important what has been said as well. Like first of all, you cannot improve what you cannot measure, right? So I think even if a startup is out there making suggestions or mapping, I think ground validation is crucial. And for our customers that are often very risk averse, it's important for them also to build confidence and trust. So we let them go out in the field. They have a lot of arborists that validate our work. We have our own arborist in-house, as I mentioned, the wildland fire specialist as well, to really validate our assumptions in the field on the ground as well, in terms of, are we correct about certain tree species, about the health of the tree? So we're really scaling that local knowledge and make that accessible for a large area of land, because that's what's crucial. I think what would be interesting to hear from others as well. How do you balance that, right? Like, what level of detail do you need? But you also need to make it work at scale as well, right? And there's a balance there. Like, some things, what you cannot measure at scale, sometimes you need to find proxies for that as well. So I think for us, it's really important that we challenge our assumptions as well. We have people out there in the field validated as well, so that we can also, and I think that's important, to add to what Anna-Lena said, like all teams should also be adaptable, right? Like if there's new insights about certain species, about climate, we have new insights about weather patterns as well. We need to be able to admit that there's a new direction that we need to move into. And I think for us, that really means in making it also actionable, because you can have a lot of detailed data layers that look great, that are very accurate. But if it's not actionable for the people on the ground or for the customer to improve their decision making, it won't be used as well. So really trying to find that balance of accuracy, scalability, but also actionability is super important for us and for our customers.
So maybe you can add a bit, Colin, you might have something to say as well about, so how do you balance the need for this really detailed and complex information on biodiversity with sort of that scalability and cost effectiveness?
Yeah, no, it is. It's a really important. It is important. I guess I'm sure Colin will have things to say about this too, because it's important whether you're below ground or above ground or in the sky. I think from our perspective, there are a couple of different parts to it. I think, first of all, ecological research over decades has demonstrated that we can measure species level change by sampling populations, meaning that we know that we don't have to count every bee or every frog to be able to see real change, really accurate change in the diversity of a system. We have now good, well-tested, robust statistical methods that enable data collection that's based on sampling to be used to estimate with really good accuracy the status of species in the broader population. So that's a really important point. But it's also important to say that to use that approach to enable sampling in order to reduce the cost and the complexity of what you're doing, it's essential that you sample in ways that are unbiased. For example, using randomized approaches to select where you sample, if that's appropriate and for what your particular research goal is, and that your sampling is dense enough that you can guard against error, so that whatever indices you're using to show change or to show status that are robust to error because you've sampled enough. And it's important to be able to flex your measurement so that what you're measuring is relevant to the question you're asking, and the habitat or ecosystem that you're in, where you are in the world, is also really important. So I think the first step in balancing detail and cost is about carefully designing the way you sample, both in terms of where and what you measure, so that you can capture enough of the important living components of that system to be able to accurately assess it, to answer the question you need to answer, but without trying to capture so much that the economics and logistics then become unworkable. And then once you've done that, the next step is to reduce the cost and complexity of doing the measuring now that you've planned to do through that sampling protocol, the how that you do it. And that's where technology comes in increasingly. Tech developments over the last few years mean that we can now collect data digitally. You've heard a lot about that already today, which means we need far fewer boots on the ground. In some cases, we can collect it in an automated way, and we can automate analysis. And both of these advances together reduce the cost and complexity of monitoring, while maintaining and often actually improving the accuracy and detail in the data and the analysis. And I think it's also really important to say that the problems with scaling the monitoring of biodiversity, they're not just about cost. They're just as much about logistical complexity that stems from the need for these really deep specialist experts to go in the field in teams, the complexity of putting that together, the time it takes them to analyze the data, the complexity in ensuring that what they do is unbiased, and so on. It's just as much about that. So technology doesn't just reduce the costs, it also reduces the logistical complexity of everything around that as well. So I think that's also a really key part.
Colin, do you have anything to add there?
I think Zoe did a great job, right? Like we can sample and we can measure how confident or unconfident we are. We can quantify uncertainty in these models, and we can do things like statistical power analyses to know, how many is enough. Like that is an answerable question. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, a lot of this has scale dependence. It can be remarkably difficult to predict which tree a random stem is in the forest, but it is possible to predict the frequency of birch stems over like 1,000 acres of New England forest, right? Like, so some things do become more predictable at larger scales, and that can be used to your advantage. And so I think that's how we're going to overcome a lot of these challenges. But again, if you're worried about these things, ask the people providing these metrics to you to to show you how they know it, show the work, right? Like these shouldn't be problems.
We're getting a lot of questions popping up in the Q&A, but I just have a couple more questions left here for the panel, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Colin, staying with you here, we had Anna-Lena talking about how these sort of exotic fungi can come in and really disrupt a system. How is Funga sort of ensuring that we don't repeat the mistakes of above ground sort of monoculture in the below ground systems?
Yeah, so just like thinking about ecosystem restoration, right? Like it's really important not only that we plant trees or however we restore trees, we also plant the right trees in the right place. We need the right native and biodiverse combinations of species at the right successional stage. And we can know those things for below ground organisms too. We just haven't asked that question very much. One way we focus on this is actually, thinking about how can we source organisms from the environment, actually that are native to this place, that naturally form these symbioses, such that we're not like taking, if we find a super fungus in Australia and try and apply everywhere, that would still be a crisis for biodiversity, even if the trees grow faster. But luckily, there's incredible complexity and diversity in these microbial communities, right? Like the number of species that exists of, microbial species in a single forest, rivals the number of tree species on Earth. There's huge natural variation, and there's more than enough to work with on that scale to actually use that biodiversity to create these outcomes, is at least our experience. And so that's how we approach that problem and think about it.
Anna-Lena, you had your hand raised. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I just want to add that it could be useful to use these indirect indicators, like if we do indicators for the habitats that we know is a scarce resource, instead of focusing on the species. That is usually easier. I think Colin was mentioning that there is easier. We have already access to data on how the environment is changing, and if we can connect that to the habitat and to the species, it's useful. Of course, we need species, but it's much less cost to do inventories of the habitat instead of the species. And it's much easier for non-specialists to look on the trees instead of the species. Mm. So it's not giving us all the information we need, but it's good. It's provided valuable indicators.
Thank you. All right, then I guess one final question here, Zoe. I'll start off with you. If people are thinking about investing in forests using something like a biodiversity credit rather than a pure carbon credit, what would you sort of advise them to look out for there?
So many things. Yeah, it's a good question. I think the headline one that I would say is try to make sure that if you're buying a credit, that it's outcome based, which means that what's been measured and reported on for that credit are the outcomes themselves, the actual changes in biodiversity, if it's a biodiversity credit, not, for example, measurement of the activities that are intended to achieve those outcomes. Because we have to start incentivizing outcomes, and that really that will be the thing that would drive change. I would also say choose credits where the measurement is quantitative. Try to avoid qualitative scoring of this is good, that's not so good. Pick credits where the quantitative analysis of gain in biodiversity, if that's what you're looking at, is mathematically and ecologically robust. And I think linked to that, really importantly, choose credits that are underpinned by real data that's sufficiently transparent that a non-specialist analyst, for example, could do some due diligence and determine that the changes that are claimed in relation to that credit are real, that you can go into the data and really show that. There's lots more that I could add, particularly around things like additionality. But I think if I start talking about additionality, we will still be here at 7 o'clock tonight. So I'll leave it there for now.
Does anyone have anything they want to add? If not, I will jump into some of our audience questions here. Anna-Lena, I think maybe this is a good one for you. How do you ensure that you have the right kind of biodiversity to ensure, long-term health and symbiosis of the ecosystem?
That's a tough one.
Mm.
There's not enough knowledge to answer that question yet. But I think in some areas we have more information than in others.
Mm.
I think for the insects, we still lack a lot of information, the knowledge. But maybe we're getting a bit more into the soil fungi, where we have a really nice data set. So we could provide some information on, for example, some species, how they act concerning sequestration of carbon and so on. So it's, and also it's a dynamic system.
Mm.
Where should we start? What is our 0 point? When did we have a good biodiversity? And when we have, are we getting down or up? So it's also a sense of deciding what is our reference, which is not really easy, I think. Is it when the ice were removed from Sweden 10,000 years ago? Or is it 1,000 years ago? Or is it 200 years ago? Where should we start?
Mm.
And then we don't know really what the biodiversity was either. So we don't know which species we had then.
Zoe, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that there are, if we're talking on a really practical level and we were advising landowners and so on, the sorts of things to do, I think there are some practical things we can say. I think removing invasive species is a really obvious one. And I think if you're restore with native species. I mean, it's really problematic to define that exactly as Anna was just saying. I mean, because is something native if it colonized an area 200 years ago? I mean, but we do have some information on that, and we have enough information to know what not to do, for example, with invasive species and things like that. And I think of diversity as a system rather than a series of individual things, and nature will, if it's given the chance, work to fill all the parts of that system if it's given the right conditions. If it's left alone, and if you don't have invasive species, and if the species that you're restoring in that area are native and adapted to the conditions, nature will in most cases take care of it. It just needs some time. So I think there are some practical things that we can do like that.
I think that kind of ties into this question here about, I mean, is it enough to sort of restore and revive these lost species, or are you trying to sort of forecast into the future to see what would be best suited for a particular environment or a particular climate? Does anyone?
Is that to me?
Anyone who wants to comment, maybe Indra can say something about what they're seeing with. Are you seeing any sort of species change related to that, or?
Yeah, definitely see that species change, of course, with the change in climate, droughts, warmth as well. And I think it doesn't matter which solution, but we need to be adaptable, right? Like with new insights, we know that certain species might survive or not survive. So I think like we need to have a baseline, but also understand that we need to adapt along the way and have new insights and maybe combine. But I think what Zoe was also trying to say, like, at least try to create a more biodiverse environment where these ecosystems can help each other to survive and grow stronger. And I think that's what we see more frequently, and what Anna-Lena also said in the southern part of Sweden, where you see massive bark beetle outbreaks because it's getting more monoculture as well. So you need to try to get ahead of that as well, but it's also complex. So I think one key to all these questions or topics as well is also accepting that we don't have all the information yet and that we might need to adapt moving forward, but use the data to inform ourselves, right? Continue monitoring, continue measuring, see what kind of impact it has, and then decide together what Anna-Lena also said, like not just one data point, but also prove the science behind it.
Thank you. Maybe for a little bit of a change of pace, we have someone who's wondering, for the academics on the panel here, how hard was it to take the leap and start a company? So there's, all these amazing and brilliant scientists like Anna-Lena who are working on researching these massive global problems. What sort of inspired you to make the leap into starting a company that focuses on one of them? Colin, you're in the academic world as well. Maybe you can speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm still actually an academic and
Mhm.
also somehow running this company, and it's terrifying. I have no idea what I'm doing. But it was just at the end of the day, it needed to happen, right? Like if I was going to see the research that my team does actually be realized at scale in the world today and actually have the climate impact that I think it can actually have, it wasn't going to happen through academic channels. It had to happen through a market mechanism. And this moment right now, the exploding interest in carbon and biodiversity was the moment. So it's something I've probably been curious about for a long time, but I used to joke like no one will ever make $1 million off of anything I discover. It's just no one cares about ecology. I'm happy to be proven wrong. And so,
but it's changing though, I would for sure.
So that motivated me, really. That was the biggest thing. I'm like, man, there's an opportunity to take the work that we do that I think is really important a lot bigger. And so that's why I did the science in the first place. And so it's in some ways an easy thing to do.
Anna-Lena, maybe you can talk a bit. I mean, is it possible for startups to work together with academia to share these data and learnings? I mean, you presented some of the data that SLU and the National Forest Registry have available, but what are sort of the benefits of knowledge sharing between both sides?
I think one way to share is to share information on species, where you find species, and you can share that in many different ways with the depositories of species observations. And for example, the SLU has one called Artdatabanken, the Swedish Species Information Center, where we collect species observations. And I know that there are many similar in other countries, similar systems. And these systems are also connected in global initiatives, so we can exchange species information with each other. So that's a really important way, that if you have species data, you could reposit it somewhere where you know that it will be used and stored in a good way. Then it will be used by scientists, and they can produce knowledge that you can use in return. And I think also not only species information, but also other types of training data is very valuable, because there's a general lack of training data and reference data that is needed to do all this AI modeling. There's plenty of remote sensing data, but not there's a general lack of training data. So I think that's where you can really we can really meet is the data sharing. I think that's really important part.
Absolutely. Indra, maybe you can speak a bit more about sort of this importance of vegetation data to help ensure that we have healthy forests.
Yeah, no, I also 100% agree with what Anna-Lena just said. Like with forests, it's even extra complex to get that data, right? Because you need an understanding of trees and forests. It's not like counting cars on satellite imagery or drone image where you can just label it by hand yourself. So it's more complex. So you really need to get very high quality data. Is very difficult. So data sharing, and we've been collaborating with researchers, with organizations that collect data in the field to get to the point where we are. So I fully agree, like more collaboration, and it's all hands on deck. We're all in this together. So I think we're also more open to share data, and especially with the forest that change more continuously, where it's not just normal changes, it's subtle changes in health, species that are taking over. So data to get to that point of that understanding is super important. Like, and that's why you need that local knowledge as well. Like, when do a certain tree species lose their leaf? And then you can take the satellite imagery of the right moment in time. When do they change colors as well? So all those small subtle changes that local people have is important to build that data set for large scale as well. And really to scale that even further to improve that decision maker by these large companies as well.
All right, so here's an interesting question. We often hear about businesses planting trees as an offset to sort of compensate for removing biodiversity kind of in another place. how do you approach, or how do you see this net effect that companies are claiming is positive? Is there a way to look at that or measure that? It's kind of an open question if anyone wants to jump in.
I can probably have a shot at that. I've worked on, so I think what this question is probably pointing at is the regulated sector at the moment. So there are parts of the economy that in some parts of the world are regulated such that if they, for example, mining companies, it's the best example, if they destroy a beautiful forest somewhere, they in some jurisdictions are duty bound to restore the equivalent forest somewhere else. And there is a lot of debate around what that means on a planetary level, and whether they can actually claim that that's overall positive. And the answer is that in these cases, it really depends. It depends what they do. It depends where they do it. It depends how well they do it. And it depends on things like the habitat type that they're trying to restore. But there have been cases where it's been done well. There's a recent paper, for example, that shows in Madagascar, a mining company that did a lot of offsetting work there, and the overall outcome over many years was in the end positive for that location. But there are also lots of examples where it's not been done well. So in the regulated sector, the answer to how do you ensure the outcome is positive is you enforce the regulation, and you absolutely include within that enforcement proper monitoring of outcomes. So it should never be enough that a mining company says, yes, this is what we plan to do, and then that's it, you stop watching the outcome. That's where the problems come in. It needs to be enforced. And then if we're talking about, there is now a big move, and I think we're going to see it within the next year, towards voluntary biodiversity credits, in the same way that there's the voluntary carbon market now. And I think that's a different question. And I think that again, it's about monitoring. We need to ensure that companies are pegging that the uplift that they are funding is pegged to their impact. So it's in at least the right part of the world, so that it's equivalent to what their impact is on. And we need to ensure that what they're paying for, what they're funding in those uplifts is measured, and it's a real outcome, and that we really know that it really happened. But before all of that, the really important thing as well is that all of these companies should have done everything they can to reduce the impacts in their supply chain at their sites before they move to compensation. So they should only be compensating for what they genuinely can't remove in terms of impact.
Thank you, Zoe. All right, so this one's for Colin, or maybe anyone else who wants to jump in here. How do you predict the value of the carbon market will change through sort of incorporation of fungi into reforestation projects? Do you think you can do you think a reforestation effort could be expedited through fungi utilization?
Yeah, so my team works a lot on this. There are lots of examples of restoring below ground microbial communities, particularly fungi, accelerating restoration outcomes in different types of ecosystems all over the world. When a lot of places where restoration happens is agricultural landscapes, which we know these soils are thrashed. We know the organisms living them look nothing like those in, say, like an intact forest. And so, yeah, taking an active restoration, we plant trees, right? Because we know it accelerates the outcomes, because planting them gets them there a lot faster than they would have, waiting for natural regeneration in certain landscapes. Absolutely the same thing can be true of microorganisms in the environment. And so, the value is linked to the rate at which you can recover biodiversity, recover carbon storage in those systems, and also, thinking about what does it mean to restore biodiversity in the landscape if we haven't restored the microorganisms that live there.
And maybe an open one, if anyone wants to jump in. How do you balance, I believe they're talking about afforestation here, planting trees for biodiversity or carbon capture versus what is lost in terms of a grassland where you would have planted those trees on? I guess maybe someone can talk about the difference between afforestation versus reforestation to start us off there.
Sure. So afforestation is where the land was never previously a forest, or at least not in the recent past, and reforestation is where it would naturally be a forest. So this, I suppose, question is referring to afforestation. I guess I straight away want to know why we're planting trees there, not somewhere else. So I think it depends. It entirely depends on the specific context that we're in. Yeah, I think priority should. I hate the word should, but generally speaking, if we give priority to land that was naturally forested land and has been deforested, if we try to recover that land as forest first, probably that's going to end up working best. Yeah.
Yes, I think maybe that's one of the things that I wish was better understood about forests is sort of this difference between reforestation and afforestation, and putting the right trees in the right places, as has come up a few times before here. We have just 5 minutes left. We've lost Anna-Lena. She mentioned she might have to drop out a bit early, but we have a question here about how do we ensure that the solutions we're building aren't too short term? Like, is there a way to avoid sort of our confirmation bias and focus on true long-term solutions? Does anyone have any thoughts about that? And Cameron, feel free to jump in if you'd like. So how do we avoid solutions that are too short-term is the question.
I think maybe one way to make it more specific maybe is like thinking about restoration, for example, whether that's above or below ground. I mean, one of the big questions is if we restore a forest, right? Like, will it be restored in 20, 40, 60, 100 years? And I don't think anyone has a really good answer for that. We want to sort of like pay for whatever the carbon's going to be today and then write it off and call it done. And I think we need to start finding ways to incentivize the long-term preservation of these systems. And people talk about things like horizontal stacking of credits. So, you know, having to re-up those, maybe a carbon credit that's captured in a forest has a lifetime that's shorter for 20 or 30 years, but could be re-upped in 20 or 30 years as that term comes to expire and you see that the forest is still there. I mean, that's just one way of thinking about it, but yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard question.
Yeah, and it definitely ties into that question of permanence, like how are we actually trapping the carbon within the forest system? But I think we've time for one more question, maybe. Let's go. Is anyone willing to speak about sort of the value between like conservation credits, deferring harvest, making sure that the forest stays in place versus the need for timber versus stock? Like, how do we balance that equation? It's a tough one. I think that comes into what Cameron presented with putting the value back in maintaining the forests and not destroying them. But any other
I certainly don't have any answers, but I would say that what we're trying to do is allow people to actually, you know, the markets to start to balance those equations, so that right now there is no payment if there's a gain in biodiversity. You can only get a payment by some kind of harvest, maybe a subsidy. And what we want is for people to actually look at what makes them financially better off, and then find the right combination for themselves, and at least then be able to have biodiversity in that equation as something for which you can get a real financial outcome.
Thank you, Cameron. Well, then I will thank everyone for joining us today. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for your presentations and for participating in our panel. Please do subscribe to the Pale Blue Dot Substack. You'll be the first to hear about these future events. We're hoping, like I mentioned before, this will just be the first in a series of research-based events. And yes, have a wonderful evening, everyone. Well, or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay.
And thank you, everyone.